To turn to the next thing I see in 2023 having a major impact on markets, I would say the situation in Ukraine. And there's a lot more there than just, there's obviously a war going on, clear, and Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. Everyone's like, Russia's the bad guy because they invaded. Okay, they did invade, but they were being provoked for 14 years. George Bush stood up in 2008 and said that he thought Ukraine and Georgia should be in NATO. And a few months later, Putin invaded Georgia and made sure Georgia would never join NATO. And then in 2014, the U.S. and UK staged a coup using the CIA and MI6 to overthrow a pro-Russian president of Ukraine. He was duly elected. They had an election. I'm not saying that he was a great guy, but he was duly elected. He was pro-Russian, looking to enter into some trade linkages with Russia, and the U.S. and UK intelligence services staged a coup, threw him out. He ran out for Russia. We put in a puppet government, and then Putin invaded and took Crimea. So first Bush makes a clumsy statement, Putin invades Georgia. Then they stage a coup, and Putin invades Crimea. Putin is telling us, don't go there. Ukraine's not going to join NATO. You've crossed a red line. Then he invaded Georgia and Crimea to show he was serious, and the U.S. still wasn't listening. Either that or we were listening and we wanted the war. And that's really my view. Now, the war is tragic. It's brutal. That's what war is. But there is a financial, economic war wrapped around the military kinetic war. We've been supplying weapons to Ukraine and training in Poland. A lot of the so-called Ukrainian troops are actually Polish troops wearing Ukrainian army uniforms because so many of the Ukrainian troops have been killed. Various weapon systems are being supplied. There's a drone war going on. Iran's giving drones to Russia. The U.S. has its own drones, they're supplying them to Ukraine, etc. So that's been pretty well vetted. But the economic financial war around it, the U.S. has put sanctions on Russia. I spent a long part of my career working on sanctions. The financial warfare, exactly the kind of thing we're talking about now, is what I had done for over 10 years, longer actually, for the intelligence community. I worked on supporting intelligence support for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., which looks at deals where foreign companies are buying U.S. companies, and you ask yourself, is there a national security threat here? It's not an antitrust review or securities law review. It's a national security review, and I used to do intelligence collections to support that analysis. So we froze the reserves of the Central Bank of Russia. We froze the reserves of oligarchs. We kicked the Russian banking system out of the international SWIFT message traffic system, that's where big banks record large transfers to each other, limits on Russian oil exports, price caps on Russian oil, and so forth. And Russia's retaliated. They banned certain exports of strategic metals, fertilizer, grain, and other essential goods, or at least to countries that are participating in the U.S. sanctions. But the point is, it has been highly, highly disruptive to the supply chain and the food chain. It's contributed to inflation, and it's getting worse. So if you combine Russia and Ukraine, they provide 25% of global exports of wheat, 35% global exports of barley. Russia provides a large percentage of global fertilizer exports. And if you look at it from the importing point of view, you say, okay, from the point of view of countries, you say, well, who gets their food from Ukraine and Russia? There you find countries get 75 to 90% of their food from those two places. And that includes countries like with large populations, Egypt, Sudan, countries in the Middle East, Kenya, and others, and many others.
Jim,
yes.
You're saying those countries you mentioned, because of this war in the Ukraine, which pissed off Russia, saying they want Ukraine to join NATO and all this stuff, is the food now goes into those countries like Sudan and all that. Does that mean that their prices will go up for food, but the possibility of starvation goes up too?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not just about price. There's money around, you can get subsidies, but starvation is a bigger problem. And they've been scrambling since the war started last February. To the extent they've been getting anything, they've been drawing down reserves from the year before. So there is grain storage, and there was some left, but now the reserves have been drawn down. Some exports are trickling through, but it's a very small amount, and believe it or not, some of the exports are going to Europe, which has other resources. And so starvation is a real, you may end up with more people dying of starvation than dying in the war. But this is playing out in real time. I was not saying everything's happened right now. It's happening, and it's going to get worse as the winter progresses. So, for example, Boeing, we talk about the supply chain. Boeing gets, how do you make airplanes? Well, they make them from aluminum and titanium. Where's that come from? Well, about 40% of it comes from Russia. What about farmers in Argentina, farmers in Brazil, farmers in parts of the United States for that matter? How do you grow crops? Well, you need nitrogen fertilizer. Where does nitrogen fertilizer come from? A lot of it comes from Russia. I was teaching at the U.S. Army War College, and they were skeptical. That's fine. I encourage that. But I said, here are the sanctions. Here's what we're going to do. None of it's going to work, and it's going to be worse than that because it's going to boomerang and hurt us. And that's what I told them, and that's exactly what's happened. The Russian ruble, remember Joe Biden saying, we're going to crush the Russian ruble. The ruble today is stronger in foreign exchange markets than it was before the war, et cetera. So Russia's oil revenues are up. Quantity might be down, but the price was up from where it was, and so they're making more money. And the foreign exchange reserves are fine, by the way, 20% in gold. So you can't freeze the gold. You can freeze dollars, you can freeze treasury securities, but not the gold. So what could get worse than what we just described? And all this is continuing and getting worse, and that's a big factor for 2023. Unfortunately, we are on a path to nuclear war. And I studied nuclear war fighting beginning in the late 1960s. And what I studied in the late 1960s, most of it was written by scholars in the late 1950s. That was the early part of the Cold War, the early part of the nuclear age, when some big brains were working on this. And scholars are Herman Kahn, who wrote a book called On Thermonuclear War. It's still in print, 600-page, warfighting manual. Herman Kahn, Henry Kissinger, Albert Wolstetter, Paul Nitze. These were the geniuses of nuclear warfighting, and I studied it. And there was a lot of technicalities, counter force, counter value, first strike, second strike, etc. They had different views on certain things, but they all said one thing: don't go there. And what they meant was avoid escalation. Nobody wakes up and says, hey, nice day for a nuclear war, I think I'll fire a missile. It's more the case that somebody does something, the other side retaliates, the first side raises the ante, the next side comes back, and you keep escalating, and you get to a point where finally somebody is trapped. They're like, okay, this is now existential. My country is at risk. My regime is at risk, etc. I'm thinking about shooting nuclear weapons. And here you get into game theory, a game theoretic approach, where the side that wasn't going to shoot first shoots first because they think the other side's going to shoot first. In other words, it's always better, first strike is always better than second strike. So if you think the other guy's going to shoot, then you shoot first, even though you didn't start out that way. And we saw a real-world example of this in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what did Kennedy and Khrushchev do? They were going down this path. Everyone said, don't go there. And they de-escalated. Khrushchev pulled the missiles out of Cuba. The U.S. pulled its missiles out of Turkey. The U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. We de-escalated, got through it. So between the scholarly approach, which I just talked about, and the practical application, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's been understood ever since. Today, we have a very lightweight crowd, warmongers, people who don't understand what I just described, or if they do, they trivialize it, and they're throwing nuclear war fighting, talking points around like they're, candy canes or something, and they are escalating. We're doing exactly what you're not supposed to do. The U.S. sanctions, yeah, but U.S. and U.K. blow up the Nord Stream pipeline, blow up the Kerch Strait Bridge. Russia says, okay, gloves are off, we're taking down the power grid in the rest of Ukraine. The U.S. says, okay, here come the Patriot missiles. And Russia says, we'll take them out before you launch them because we got hypersonic missiles. We're doing exactly what everyone said not to do. We're heading for nuclear war. I don't know